The winter air was sharp, cutting through layers of worn uniforms as soldiers huddled in shattered buildings, their breath fogging in the freezing dark. Stalingrad had become more than a city. It was a graveyard of steel, stone, and flesh. Streets once filled with life were now twisted with wreckage, riddled with the echoes of artillery and the cries of the wounded. The Germans had come with the promise of swift conquest, yet every step forward was clawed back by men who refused to yield, fighting not only for ground, but for survival itself. The Volga River ran thick with ice and danger, ferries braving artillery fire to bring reinforcements and supplies across under the cover of night. Soviet troops, often fresh from farms and factories, were pushed into the inferno with little more than rifles and resolve. Many never made it past the shoreline, their bodies claimed by the frozen current or the relentless shells raining from above. Those who did cross found themselves in a labyrinth of ruins where every window, every cellar, hid a rifle barrel or a grenade. German divisions advanced with tanks rumbling down avenues, but the city swallowed them whole. Snipers lurked in shadows, hidden in chimneys or perched inside skeletal factories. Entire squads vanished in ambushes staged from the upper floors of crumbling buildings. Fighting was not measured in miles, but in meters. Each wall, each stairwell, each room fought over with grenades, knives, and bare hands. The ground was so soaked with blood and ice that boots froze to it. Supplies dwindled, and hunger gnawed at bellies more viciously than bullets. Rats were hunted as if they were prey, a rare prize in a place where bread had more value than gold. Frostbite blackened fingers, and yet rifles were clutched tighter because to loosen grip meant death. German soldiers who once marched with discipline and confidence now staggered through snow-choked alleys, weary and hollow-eyed. They fought ghosts as much as men, each skirmish blurring into the endless roar of artillery. When the Soviet counterattack came, it was like the tightening of a noose. The Red Army struck from the steppes, encircling the city in a vast iron grip. What had been an assault turned into a trap, and the hunter became the hunted. German commanders pleaded for relief, but the winter sky offered none, only the howl of icy winds sweeping through the ruins. Their airdrops fell short, their tanks froze, and their men wasted away inside the tightening ring. Stalingrad had become hell itself, and yet it was a hell both sides refused to abandon. Pride, orders, and desperation bound them there. For every shell that fell, for every building that collapsed into rubble, men emerged again, covered in dust and smoke, screaming, shooting, clawing to stay alive. It was not strategy that kept them fighting. It was the raw, unbroken will to endure. When it finally ended, when the last pockets of resistance were silenced and the survivors stumbled out of basements with frostbitten hands raised in surrender, the city was unrecognizable, a landscape of ruins haunted by silence after months of thunder. Hundreds of thousands lay buried beneath the debris, never to be named, their stories lost to the wind. Stalingrad was no longer just a battle. It was a scar carved into history, a place where armies were ground to dust, and the meaning of victory was measured not in triumph, but in survival. The city of Stalingrad did not fall like other cities. It did not break under bombs or surrender under pressure. Instead, it dissolved into a battlefield where every stone, every room, and every pile of rubble was contested. What had once been a thriving industrial hub on the Volga became a maze of ruins, each ruin a fortress, each fortress a grave. The fighting was no longer about capturing wide stretches of territory or outmaneuvering on open plains. It was measured in staircases, in windows, in the distance from one wall to another. When the Germans first entered the city, their armored columns pushed forward with confidence. Tanks rumbled down boulevards, their turrets scanning for targets. Infantry followed in tight formation, believing their momentum would break Soviet resistance. But Stalingrad was not open country. It was a broken city of twisted steel and shattered concrete. The wide streets that had once promised speed became kill zones, covered by hidden snipers and machine guns. From the upper floors of bombed-out factories, Soviet marksmen picked off officers, halting columns with a single shot. In the factories, warehouses, and apartment blocks, battles erupted not just over buildings, but within them. Grenades rolled down stairwells, exploding into smoke and screams. Soldiers fired through walls, doors, and ceilings, knowing the enemy was only meters away. Sometimes the combat grew so close that bayonets and knives replaced rifles, and men fought hand to hand in the dark, choking on dust and fear. The Soviets adopted tactics that made the German advantage in tanks and artillery almost useless. They called it hugging the enemy, staying so close in combat that German forces could not call in airstrikes or heavy guns without hitting their own men. This forced the fighting into brutal, intimate clashes. Streets that once echoed with the hum of trams now rang with the metallic clash of rifles and the desperate shouts of men locked in combat. Snipers became legends in this war of shadows. They perched in hidden nests inside chimneys, behind piles of rubble, or within half-destroyed buildings, waiting for the slightest movement. Every German soldier who stepped into the open risked falling to an invisible shot. The duel between Soviet sharpshooters and German marksmen added another deadly layer to the struggle, turning ruined neighborhoods into hunting grounds where death came silently. The factories were among the fiercest battlegrounds. The Red October steel plant, the Barricade gun factory, and the tractor plant became fortresses of industry and blood. Conveyor belts, once used to build machines of war, were now barricades where men crouched and fired. Giant machines stood silent, riddled with bullet holes, while soldiers crawled beneath them for cover. In the chaos of smoke and steel, it was often impossible to tell where one line ended and another began. Every corner of Stalingrad seemed to demand sacrifice. For the Germans, progress was slow and costly. They won streets only to lose them again, losing men for every meter gained. For the Soviets, there was no retreat. Orders from above declared that the city must be held at all costs, and retreat meant execution. Soldiers arrived across the Volga under fire, some without rifles, expected to take the weapon of a fallen comrade and keep moving. Yet they fought with a ferocity that shocked their enemies, driven not only by command, but by the knowledge that behind them was their homeland, their families, their very survival. The fighting was relentless. Days bled into nights filled with artillery fire and the cries of the wounded trapped under rubble. Soldiers slept in basements alongside corpses, waking to the sound of boots above and rushing into battle again. The city's air was thick with smoke, and its streets stank of blood, gunpowder, and frost. Stalingrad became a vision of hell where modern warfare was stripped down to its rawest form. Men grappling for inches of ground, clawing through debris, and refusing to let go. It was not about sweeping maneuvers or brilliant tactics anymore. It was about survival in a city that had become death itself. By the time the battle shifted to its next stage, Stalingrad was no longer a city but a shattered battlefield carved out of human will and endless sacrifice. The Soviet counterattack at Stalingrad was not a sudden strike, but a carefully prepared storm waiting to break. By November 1942, German forces had been locked in the city for months, bleeding men and resources in a fight that consumed them inch by inch. Their focus was fixed on the ruins along the Volga, where they believed victory was close at hand. What they did not see or did not want to believe was the massive Soviet buildup outside the city. Across the steppe, hidden from view, whole armies were gathering, supplied and ready for a strike that would turn the battle upside down. The plan was simple, but devastating. Instead of throwing more men directly into Stalingrad's ruins, the Soviets aimed for the flanks. The German Sixth Army, bogged down inside the city, relied on weaker Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions to hold the vast stretches of open ground to the north and south. These troops, poorly equipped for the brutal Russian winter and spread too thin, stood in the path of the Red Army. When the Soviet assault began on November 19, it hit like a thunderclap. Artillery shook the frozen ground, roaring across the steppe in a barrage that split the morning silence. Nenstula. Waves of Soviet infantry and tanks surged forward through the snow, smashing into the Axis lines. The Romanian soldiers, overwhelmed and outgunned, broke under the assault. German commanders scrambled to respond, but their reserves were thin, and the Soviets had momentum on their side. By the second day, the attack had punched deep into enemy territory, and the pincers of the Red Army were beginning to close. From the north and south, the jaws of the Soviet offensive moved swiftly, driving across the open steppe. Within days, they linked up near the town of Kalash, west of Stalingrad. The trap was sprung. The entire German Sixth Army, along with part of the 4th Panzer Army, was cut off inside the ruins they had fought so hard to seize. What had once been an attack turned into a prison. a vast encirclement that trapped more than 250,000 Axis troops in a frozen wasteland. Inside the pocket, the hunters had become the hunted. German soldiers who had fought with grim determination in the city now found themselves surrounded, their supply lines severed. Their only hope was air resupply, but the Luftwaffe was unable to deliver even a fraction of what was needed. Food ran short, ammunition dwindled, and fuel was almost gone. Horses were slaughtered for meat, and soldiers shivered in dugouts and ruins with little protection against the Russian winter. Soviet forces tightened the noose with each passing week. The rain grew smaller, the pressure greater. German generals urged Hitler to allow a breakout, but he refused, ordering them to hold their ground. To retreat was unthinkable. To surrender was forbidden. So the men in Stalingrad were left to freeze and starve, dying by the thousands each day. The city that had once been a target of conquest became their tomb. The Soviets pressed their advantage relentlessly. They bombarded the pocket, cut off any attempt at relief, and pushed deeper into the shattered city. Street by street, block by block, they advanced through the ruins that had cost so much blood to hold. German resistance grew weaker, their lines thinner, their spirit broken under the weight of hunger and despair. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was a shell of its former strength. When the final Soviet assault came, it was overwhelming. German units collapsed under the weight of superior numbers and firepower. Isolated groups surrendered, their commanders unable to fight on. In the last days, Field Marshal Paulus himself, promoted by Hitler in a futile attempt to inspire defiance, gave in to the inevitable. He surrendered what remained of his army on February 2, 1943. The defeat was total. Of the hundreds of thousands encircled, only a fraction survived captivity to ever see their homeland again. Stalingrad marked not just the loss of an army, but the shattering of a myth. The invincibility of the Wehrmacht had been broken, and the momentum of the war shifted. For the Soviets, it was a victory bought with unimaginable sacrifice, but it was also a turning point that echoed across the world. The encirclement of Stalingrad was more than a military maneuver. It was the moment the tide of the war turned, when the hunters of Europe were dragged into a trap of their own making. From then on, it was the Red Army that advanced, and Germany that would be forced to retreat. Stalingrad was the grave of the Sixth Army, and the beginning of the end for Hitler's war in the East. When the smoke cleared and the last guns fell silent, Stalingrad stood as little more than rubble, yet it had become a symbol far greater than any city. It was here that entire armies were ground down, where steel and flesh were consumed in equal measure, and where the tide of war shifted forever. The battle left behind a wasteland of ruins and unmarked graves, but it also marked the breaking point of German ambition and the rise of Soviet momentum. Stalingrad was not simply won, it was endured, and its legacy remains one of the most brutal reminders of the price of war.